So just have a moment's silence just to get yourself centered and relaxed. Calm the emotions in the mind. Thank you. So just intone mentally and quietly to yourself, and I will say it out loud. O hidden life, vibrant in every atom. O hidden light, shining in every creature. O hidden love, embracing all in oneness. May each who feel themselves as one with thee know they are also one with every other. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Thank you. So the Theosophical Society, founded in 1875, and our purpose is very important in terms of our focus is to create the nucleus of a new society, a society of divine wisdom, where its members have an emphasis on unity as opposed to distinctions, culture, gender, ethnicity, etc. So our work is to lift consciousness of humanity, and doing that by serving humanity as a whole, and therefore changing our own perspective and consciousness in doing so. Thus, to help us with that, we encourage comparative study of comparative religion, philosophy, and science, and investigations into ourselves and the unexplained laws of nature. So the Society as an organization has no authority figures or dogmas. Freedom of thought is encouraged. And our president-founder, Colonel Olcott, suggested we're all students inquiring into life, and we're all on the road together. So we try and keep that open-minded, inquiring approach for all members and everyone. So welcome to the Wellington branch this evening, and we're carrying on in that tradition with our presentation this evening. So this is our, as I said at the introduction, our second session of art, spirituality, and theosophy, and it's gives me great pleasure to introduce Caleb Gordon from the City Art Gallery in Wellington. He's the public program manager of Toy Art for Experience Wellington. He is passionate about sharing the power and value of art in our communities, making him a joy and a terror at dinner parties. So that's a heads up for that. We're not talking about art. He's pursuing work towards the radical proposition that we all deserve and collectively have the means to live a good life. Caleb's session this evening is the innovation and the intangible, the paintings of Hilma of Klint. So Caleb will take a look at Hilma's work and practice and see how her lifelong devotion to the spiritual can be seen in her paintings, where she sought to capture what is beyond the visible. And so Caleb, welcome. It's great to have you here, and over to you. So Sushma will do her technical things, and Caleb will do his.
You have to unmute, Caleb. Thanks.
I think I'm fully on now.
You're good.
Awesome. Thanks for hosting me. I always like an opportunity to come and talk to people about the work that we've been doing. So like Simon said, I'm based at City Gallery Wellington, in Wellington of all places, and I look after the public program, and a big part of that is organising all the public events, which usually focus around talks and tours about the art we have on display. And we had the great pleasure of hosting Hilma of Klint, the secret paintings, from December through to about February this year, which was kind of a huge show and a huge deal for New Zealand. I think we're technically the only venue in the Southern Hemisphere that hosted her works, and they've now all returned to Sweden. And I don't think they'll ever be coming back because they're just a little bit delicate. So it was that fantastic opportunity to have it. And so I got to spend 3 months just hanging out with these works and the people talking about the works and kind of sucking up as much information as I can. So I thought tonight I'd take you through some of the main ideas that I've kind of pulled from people, really looking at Hilma's paintings, kind of all the different ways that she was really innovative for an artist at the time, and then flow into kind of looking at why or how perhaps kind of her interest in spiritualism really kind of drove the innovation. Because I think you can look at Hilma's work as this kind of really fantastic, innovative artist from art history, but at the same time, there's this whole other story behind it about what's driving her to do this, to kind of innovate in this way, to create these works, to also like kind of hide this whole body of work as well, and what was the purpose behind her work. That really adds a whole new layer and kind of texture to her work. And so I think divorcing Hilma from her spiritual interests really kind of reduced the power of the work. And I think it's kind of a real weakness in art history, because there's a number of artists from around that period in kind of the late 18th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, that's right, who were really engaged with spiritualism, really interested in philosophy and religion and spirituality. And kind of when we've moved all their work into kind of art history canon and museums and galleries, we kind of remove all the spiritual and religious stuff because it's kind of too hard for us to deal with in our institutions. And I think this rediscovery of Hilma and representing her work is a real declaration that kind of actually we can do better and we need to do better, because now that Hilma's demanded that we rewrite art history, maybe we need to tell some better stories about the art history we already have. So I've tried to illustrate this talk as much as I can to make it as interesting as possible. But I thought I would just start with this quote, which I discovered today, because Hilma wrote endless notebooks. So we have some really good commentary about her and her practice in her life. But I thought this one was really interesting because it's Hilma kind of writing a note to herself as she's reflecting on, you know, a good couple of decades of practice of exploration through her art and through spirituality. And it's actually the last entry she puts in her notebook because she dies unexpectedly. I thought like it's a really poignant kind of quote to begin on, because it's kind of like the end of Hilma's life, but it's almost like halfway through the story. Because if you're familiar with Hilma and her work, it's because one of the big parts of her story is her work was locked away for a number of decades. And so though the work is historic, it's really kind of fresh to all of us as an audience. And so what I'm going to do is just start with kind of a brief biography of Hilma and her history, and then move into the paintings themselves. And so Hilma painted some of the most original abstract works in the 20th century. And while she removed herself from art history, now that they've been revealed, we can see that she painted some of the work kind of at the same time or earlier than many of the artists that we claim in the Western canons to be the innovators or the originators of abstraction in Western art, like Kandinsky, I know was discussed last week. And so really, when we're telling the story of Hilma, it's about how Hilma's work's been hidden and revealed and what we do with it now that we have it. Because late in her life, Hilma had a feeling that she hadn't received the recognition that she had hoped for in her lifetime. She left instructions that all of her work should be hidden from public view for 20 years after the time of her death. And so she placed a plus and an X on the back of her canvases and her notebooks, and that she wanted hidden away. And these were stored away in the care of her family. And Hilma hoped that a future audience would be better placed to understand the works and be ready for the messages that they contained. And that kind of at her death in 1944, the works ended up being packaged away and given to her nephew in kind of his care and the care of the family ongoing, and kind of waited for the future. And when I say her nephew Eric F. Klint kind of, was looking after her collection of works, it was around 1,300 paintings, 124 notebooks, and about 26,000 individual pages of handwritten and typed notes. So it was a huge collection of work that I don't think Eric F. Klint quite understood he would be the benefactor of when Hilma died. She wanted the work hidden away, she wanted it cared for by her family, and it just kind of ended up on his doorstep at some point. But thankfully, kind of he cared for it, he looked after it, which is kind of the only reason we really have it for us to see today, because there's endless examples of kind of artworks and any form of kind of creativity that's just lost because a family member didn't care to look after it, unfortunately. And so Hilma died in 1944, and she asked the works be hidden for 20 years. The math doesn't quite work out because we don't actually see the works kind of come back into the public eye until the 1980s. But for us here in Hilma's future, it's kind of wonderful to imagine that now in the past decade, now that we've seen these works out on kind of large scale exhibitions across kind of Europe and North America and here in New Zealand, that we are the future audience that Hilma kind of dreamed of. But what I really find quite interesting, because there was this really strong bent in Hilma's work around it being transformational, now that we've kind of revealed this work and we know about it, we kind of have to ask ourselves the question, like, what does it mean that Hilma kind of over a century ago made this work for us as this future audience? It's meant to be kind of this enlightened future audience for it. It kind of puts pressure on us to ask the question, are we an enlightened future audience that she wanted, or do we still have work to do to kind of be worthy of the message inside Hilma's work and the transformational potential of it all? And so the wonderful thing about Hilma's work is it's open, it's filled with hope, and it does challenge us to make a better world. The work's really radical in its visual language for the time, which is what I'll be talking about, but it's also really radical in its intent, like I've kind of touched on, because the intent of the project that Hilma had is she wanted to create a series of works that, when viewed, would transform people, transform society away from the materialist world that she saw was on the edge of kind of constant bankruptcy and war and destroying itself, and kind of create work that would heal the world and transform us by pushing us beyond the material into an invisible realm, kind of a spiritual enlightened place. And she felt that art was kind of the essential role in that. And so I find Hilma's work really vocal and vital, and there's so much going on. And I think it speaks to us from the past, and part of it, the task is taking us, part of it, the task for us as a future audience we have now, is kind of trying to figure out exactly what Hilma was trying to say in her work, because it's really open and generative and generous, but it kind of asks us to question who we are and how we live our lives, and kind of engages us as a viewer. And so I think part of the other question is, who was Hilma af Klint? Because she is a bit of a mysterious figure. I mean, she's someone who obviously has a strong sense of purpose. If she's going to lock away thousands of pieces of work that she thought could change the world for a couple of decades, and kind of have arrived back a century later and have this kind of power to punch really hard in the kind of cultural psyche of at least kind of Western art. But she was born in 1862 in Sweden to a prominent naval family. And this photograph gives us kind of a sense of kind of who she was, I think. It's from the 1880s, photographed in one of the studios that she was working in. And so Hilma graduated from the Royal College of Art, where she studied for around 6 years. And this photo was probably taken just as her career was starting. And Hilma had a really promising career. She won a number of prizes while she was studying at the college. She'd been awarded the studio to work out of. She'd kind of established herself as this kind of respected and prominent artist of kind of portraits, landscapes, and botanical studies. And it was her careful observation of nature that really kind of was winning her an audience who were kind of ready to buy her work. She had a ready market. And so she actually managed to make a living as an artist and managed to support herself, which I think it's a radical proposition when any artist manages to make a living for themselves using their practice. But the fact that this was Hilma as a woman in the kind of 1880s kind of makes it that much more impressive, and that much more, I think, kind of important for reflection, because it tells us a lot about who Hilma was and her character, and that she had that kind of strength. And we don't often look at Hilma's academic work because that's not what we're interested in, because we're interested in her spiritually infused work. But I do think there's kind of something in her academic work that's really interesting to kind of understand, because Hilma had the opportunity to live a really comfortable life as an academic artist, supporting herself, living the life how she wanted, not supported by a family and not linked to her family in any way, kind of living the life she wanted. But this is an example of one of her academic works, just to kind of, show exactly what she was up to and what we don't really see now in the story of Hilma. And this work's Andromeda, from 1888. And it's an example of one of her prize-winning works when she was studying at the college. And it's for a work like this that she was awarded the studio to continue working out of. And so I imagine you're mostly familiar with the Greek myth of Andromeda, but in a nutshell, she's a princess who was chained to a rock on the coast to be sacrificed to one of the many sea monsters of ancient Greece to kind of satisfy and protect her, the kingdom that she comes from. But she was saved by the hero Perseus, who was flying back from decapitating Medusa. And so this is Andromeda chained to the rock is one of those classic figures represented in Western art because it's a chance to paint a naked woman, and Western artists love painting naked women. It is the history of Western art in many respects. But usually she's depicted kind of cowering in fear or wailing at her fate, or kind of gazing longingly at Perseus as he's arrived to save her because eventually they will marry. But Hilma's Andromeda is kind of none of that. There's no fear. She kind of looks like she's expecting the monster to arrive, that she's ready for it, that she's kind of prepared to take charge of the situation, despite the perilous outcome that's, you know, meant to be her death. There's something really authoritative about her Andromeda. It's kind of like perhaps she's, you know, the captain of a ship, which I think kind of plays into this naval analogy that you can kind of pull through Hilma in her work. But I think it's this kind of academic work is a really interesting thing to look at, just to be like, okay, but who was Hilma as a person? What can it tell us about her? And it is that I think work like this really suggests that Hilma as an artist is someone who's willing to take a different approach and prepared to break away from tradition and to tell a different story, or to kind of reframe kind of classic stories that we might know. But despite the kind of power and beauty of the academic work, it really dissatisfied Hilma, and she began to experiment in secret to kind of energize her work using spirituality as a spur to drive the practice, which took place in private and in collaboration with other artists and supporters. And so, returning back to this photo of Hilma in her studio, I think it tells us something really interesting around how Hilma thinks about herself as an artist and what her practice means to her. Because this is like a studio portrait. It's Hilma as the artist at work in her studio, but it's really not the classic photo that we're expecting. Here we have Hilma kind of reclining. She's got kind of her knuckles on her head with that thoughtful gaze. This isn't kind of the artist at work with kind of the palette in hand at the easel, kind of executing something, as you might expect from the studio portrait. It's kind of Hilma the thinker. I always think of that classic Rodin sculpture of the thinker. Like, this is Hilma really thinking about how she's presenting herself. And it's also, I think, notable that she's leaning towards the portrait in the background, because that's a portrait that she's painted of her grandfather, Gustav of Klint. And so, as I said earlier, Hilma's family comes from this kind of well-established naval family. I think she's a 7th generation child from naval captains. And so she's this child of generations of mappers and cartographers and merchants and explorers. And Gustav was particularly well known for mapping the seas outside of Sweden, making them able to be navigated, kind of making the unknown known. And considering the family legacy and the home life and education Hilma would have had, you know, it can help us understand who Hilma was and kind of her approach to painting, you know, from this family of kind of seafarers and explorers. And Julia Voss, who's one of Hilma's biographers, has said that if Hilma was born a male, she would have followed this tradition and become, you know, a merchant sailor. But because she was a woman, she wasn't, you know, allowed to follow this tradition in the 1880s. So she had to find another route. So Hilma trains as an artist, but she doesn't approach her training in the kind of classic sense. Hilma uses her training as an artist, but asks the same questions as kind of generations of men in her family beforehand. Like, what is beyond the visible? How can you map it? And Hilma chooses to do this kind of mapping the spiritual realm rather than mapping the oceans like kind of her male ancestors before her. And all of this is happening at a time of massive change. I'm sure some other speakers will touch on this. Probably, I can't recall her name at the end of the sessions. We'll be speaking about Hilma in a few weeks. But the massive change was happening in the world, and it was impacting kind of the way Hilma understood the way you should live your life. And the world was changing due to industrialization. Populations were moving and becoming more urbanized. Scientific discoveries were transforming the way we understood the world and kind of expanding it. And we're becoming more connected. And so the speed with which the world was kind of moving and changing kind of demanded that people had something to hold on to. And that's partly what some people say accounts for the rise in the popularity of kind of different spiritualist movements at the time. And kind of throughout her life, Hilma was devoted to a number of different spiritualist movements, often related, that stretched across kind of spirituality, religion, and philosophy. Now I'm actually going to show you some paintings. I can pause here for a moment if anyone has questions. Happy to keep this conversational.
Any thoughts, anyone?
Is it okay to take screenshots?
Yeah, most of the stuff is pretty available online. It's all bits I've pulled off the exhibition, so.
Thank you.
Is this what you're showing right now? Is that a photograph? And who would have taken that? Or is it a painting of herself?
It's a photograph, so it's a kind of a studio portrait, so it would have been quite new photographic technology, and so Hilma would have been posing for it. So I'm not quite sure who the photographer was, but because she'd won a number of awards from the Royal College, and this was the studio, I believe she was awarded as part of her prize. I imagine it was probably taken for the Royal Academy for some type of advertisement or record keeping to show like she's the one who's kind of the best at the moment. But it's a very early photograph that we've used digital technology to make it very, very nice, because the original is a bit blurry, I'll be honest.
Thanks, Edward. Chris. You're on mute, Chris. Oh no, you're still on mute.
Yep.
Okay, you're off mute, so speak, Chris. We still can't hear you for some reason. May not be plugged in correctly.
Oh, that looks better.
No, we still can't hear you, buddy. No, sorry.
Is there any chance I could ask a question, Simon?
Sorry. Okay. Suzanne.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I just wondered, did we know the names of the other artists that did the spiritual art studies with Hilma, Caleb?
So we do know the names of some artists, because we know there's long lists of people who belong to the various societies in Sweden. There's another one of the groups because throughout her life, which I'll talk about later on, Hilma kind of moves constantly in these circles of women who are her supporters and who she collaborates with for this work. And we know the name of some of them, but not all of them.
Okay.
And there's various reasons for that, which normally come down to class, if I'm totally honest.
Yeah, thank you.
Chris, have you got any luck? No. All right, we might have to sort your technology out later.
We'll just, type into the
Yep.
thing, but I'll move on for now. I'll just keep pausing at opportune moments. Here we go. So what I'm really here to talk about tonight is abstraction in Hilma's work, because that was the big thing that we're all celebrating and getting really excited about with Hilma af Klint, because her work appears at this moment where in Western art, artists were abandoning kind of traditional modes of figurative painting and moving towards abstraction. And it's this moment where a lot of different artists are doing it at the same time. And there's always that question around who did it first, because when we're writing art history, that's the type of question that we like to ask for some reason. And that was a lot of artists were engaging with the same ideas, reading the same things, coming from the same culture. And so it all kind of happens at the same time. But the interesting thing about Hilma is she's very much not at the center of things. She's on the fringes of kind of the European art movement. They're very well connected from what we can tell from her travels. And I think the fact she's from a naval family tells you that she's quite well connected. She knows how to get around and stay connected with people. But it looks at her work actually was probably abstracting kind of a decade before many of the other artists who we say kind of this is the first abstract work. And I think part of it as well is many of those artists like Kandinsky were very accomplished self-promoters in a way that Hilma af Klint wasn't. She wasn't interested in being the first in anything. She was interested in her work kind of transforming the world. I think it kind of shows their different approaches to how they thought of their work, but it's really interesting to kind of throw Hilma into the art history conversation because it really problematizes the history we've got and demands that we rewrite art history, which of course people don't want us to do because MoMA already has all the art they want and they're telling the story and they don't want to insert someone new into it, which is kind of the crux of the problem, MoMA being the Vatican of art history. But yeah, Hilma is often referred to as kind of one of the first abstract artists in Western art. And when we talk about Hilma as kind of this first abstract artist, it really flattens the conversation, because she's not this artist who arrives at this abstract style and just kind of keeps creating work. She's constantly exploring, constantly innovating. So really, when we talk about Hilma, we should be talking about the many abstract styles of Hilma, because I think she's not an abstract artist. I think she's just a constant innovator who's developing endless examples of abstract art while she's exploring what she can create, and while she's reaching for a way to communicate and kind of materialize on canvas these spiritualist conversations and learnings that she has. And so I think as we look through her works, and we look mainly at the paintings from the temple in this conversation tonight, you can see all these different styles popping up. And what we have here is an example of one of the first series that she created from 1906. Oh, sorry. Let me just find my place again. So this is a painting from 1906. It's part of a series called Primordial Chaos. And it was kind of Hilma's first attempt at abstraction. So this is the first in the painting to the temple cycle, which was ended up being a decade-long project, and it was commission that Hilma took from a group of spiritual masters that she and a group of friends who were part of a spiritualist group called the Five had begun communicating with through various sessions. And I will return to them later in the session. And so they basically received this commission from the spirit saying, we're going to give you these astral paintings to create, and they're going to change the world. They're a message for humanity. And this is Hilma's first attempt. In Primordial Chaos, I think it's about 26 works in total, painting between 1906 and 1907. And it's also her first attempt at solo abstraction as well, which I'll also return to that comment later on. And you get a sense that these are kind of tends to the first steps into a style of abstraction. And so while the forms are kind of beginning to look kind of like nothing, which is a way of describing abstraction, there's also kind of the inclusion of text, recognizable figures, and you kind of get the sense that they're diagrams. But it's in the series you begin to see forms and ideas that we see play out across Hilma and the rest of the rest of Hilma's works. Forms like spirals, flower forms, letters, and they all capture kind of the spiritualist language that Hilma was kind of tuned into, and also the idea of kind of a color language as well. And so this is, I think, Primordial Chaos number 9. And this is, I think, is a really great example to see kind of how Hilma is trying to come to a language or find a way to communicate. We've got the spirals in here, which is a classic symbol she kind of brings back again and again. In this case, the spiral is actually the shell of 2 snails. And snails are also a lovely creature that show up again and again in Hilma's work right up to the end of her life. I kind of think that she's probably attracted to them because snails are naturally hermaphroditic. They contain both the female and the male element. And kind of what Hilma's really speaking about Primordial Chaos is this, the beginning of time, the beginning of chaos, the universe rising out of it in kind of wholeness and completeness before it breaks apart into what Hilma discussed in her notebooks as binaries. And so all of Hilma's work often is talking about binaries as return to wholeness. And so here you have these 2 snails, which represent this idea of kind of the hermaphrodite that contains both, but they've been overlaid. And so one snail's yellow and one snail's green. I think the green snail is probably actually meant to be blue because in Hilma's color language, yellow represents masculine energy and blue represents feminine energy. And when you see the green, it's those energies coming back together into balance. So what Hilma's playing with here is this idea of kind of layering and bringing things back into balance. She's trying to represent this return to balance, this return to connection in her work. You can see at the top there that kind of rose form, which I'll talk about as well. The language she's included here, Hilma and a number of the women she worked with would create work under different personas that were both masculine and feminine. Vestal, I think, was one of Hilma's personas, and Asket is one of Anna Castle's. You've got to read the notebooks to work everything out, and it's all written in Swedish and German, which I'm not particularly fluent in. so I can't speak with confidence, but smarter people than me have begun translating her notebooks so we can decode her paintings, which is also part of Hilma's project. But the other work that I want to bring up here is this other one, Primordial Chaos 20, off the top of my head, yes, 20. And so and I think this one's really interesting because again, you've got this the blue and the yellow, and it's got the W and the U. So when we have language in Hilma's work, sometimes it's Latin, sometimes it's Swedish. Often it's a spiritual language that we can't actually read because it's a language that's not for us. But Hilma spends a lot of time after she creates these paintings trying to decode the paintings, leaving us extensive notes about them. And here W and U represent kind of the two core concepts, one being the material, one being the spiritual. So this idea of upper and lower. So that's what W and U represent here. But why I brought this one up is because I was trying to find paintings that had kind of really obvious spiritualist elements in here. And so you've got the crucifix form in the center here. And actually it's a Rosicrucian crucifix because it's got the rose on top of it. And Hilma was really, she had a great deal of knowledge about Rosicrucianism and was something that you can kind of flow in through her work. She often wore a silver cross with circles on the where the cross meets, kind of as a really subtle Rosicrucian cross. And it's a piece of jewelry she wore for most of her life. So there's this real, she's kind of bringing in all these elements here to kind of leave these kind of, I suppose, breadcrumbs around places to go to kind of see the begin to decode the work. But this is kind of the first set of works where Hilma's really experimenting with abstraction. She's kind of taking tentative steps playing with it. But for me, these really come across as kind of diagrams because they're not quite abstract, but they're kind of very much on the way there. And so then the next series is called the 7-Pointed Star series. And this is actually a group of works I haven't seen in person, but I keep seeing photos of them, so I'm going to talk about them. The 7-Pointed Stars, one of the very brief comments I actually came across today is in a Christian belief, a 7-pointed star is a symbol of protection, which is not something I've actually seen in any of the writings about Hilma's work, but that might be something that she was reaching for here. But with this series, you can kind of see Hilma really developing an abstract style and pushing herself. But it's obviously a style that's really influenced by organic forms and kind of feels like they're also trying to describe abstract forms. This work itself is called Evolution Number 9. And you get a sense it's kind of a plant, probably a flower, but it feels like Hilma's kind of looking deeper into this work. And so part of what Hilma was really reaching for in her spiritualist thinking and the work she was doing there that was informing her painting was trying to find ways to reach beyond the material world, beyond the visible, into invisible worlds and kind of capture what's happening there and find ways to bring that into our world through her painting. And it really does feel like in a work like this that she is taking a look at something that exists in our world, but trying to look at it through a different lens or look at with kind of eyes that can kind of see beyond the world that we're familiar with, pulling it apart to kind of reveal elements that make up kind of the function of a plant or revealing these elements behind it. And botanical studies was something Hilma was really kind of had an exceptional talent for. And she illustrated a number of scientific texts. And so I can easily imagine Hilma applying these skills of observation and study, but rather than looking to capture kind of the form of what's in front of her, instead imagining what she can't see, how these plants might exist in a spiritual sense, or how they might look in the new world of kind of waves and atoms that the scientists were only just discovering and publishing work on. And I think it's a work like this, and it's this kind of style of abstraction that we kind of feel, although I feel was really driven by Hilma pushing herself to manifest unseen worlds on her canvas. And it's this series of works many art historians have kind of described as being quite dark and solemn. I think it's usually the kind of the muddy colors that she paints with here. And I think that really comes across when you see the next series of works, which was called The 10 Largest. And so this is a photo of some of the 10 largest installed at our gallery at City Gallery, Wellington. We had kind of the unique privilege of actually being able to have a wall big enough for all of them. The 10 in total, as the title of the series suggests. They're kind of over 3 meters tall. So these enormous works that do really feel like you could almost jump into them because they're kind of so vibrant and rich. And they're kind of the superstars of the series, of kind of a lot of Hilma's work. And that this kind of large scale means that they kind of was something that was quite unprecedented at the time of place where Hilma was living. And they also represent this kind of incredible period of creation. Hilma painted all 10 of these works over a period of 40 days, and kind of ignoring the kind of mediumistic way Hilma talks about painting. I think it's just evidence of Hilma's kind of extraordinary talent, and that she's able to kind of create 10 such unique works with such skill over such a short period of time. But if you look at this kind of this visual language compared to kind of the 7-pointed stars, you can kind of get a sense of something biological, organic happening there, but it really opens up and energizes in a way that those kind of earlier 2 series just haven't. And so it kind of feels like, also like it just feels like these works have exploded out of nowhere. There's nothing else like them happening at the time. If you look at other artists exhibiting works, no one else is creating work in the style, at the scale, at this energy. Even looking at folk traditions from Sweden, no one's really painting this way. And so it kind of feels like Hilma's created this whole new world of form and color. And the abstract language here is one that feels full of joy and play. All the elements appear to kind of be in motion. They just kind of seem like they're floating in space, kind of spinning and swirling, almost mating with each other in some places. And it's this idea that kind of runs through a lot of Hilma's work, this compulsion to kind of keep moving and keep connecting, which I think is kind of a universal message that you can really apply to a number of Hilma's work. And so these are the 10 largest is a series that looks at the human life cycle. So what we're looking at here, the 2 orange ones are youth and the 4 purple are adulthood or midlife. We've truncated off childhood and old age, unfortunately. Oh yeah, here's some closer ups of them. But yeah, you get that sense of, if you see them in person, obviously it's a lot more affecting. But even here, you kind of get the sense that all these paintings kind of, the surfaces feel like they're kind of whole new worlds have been created, and there's some type of energy or movement happening, that all these works are kind of, all these pieces are kind of moving together, swirling and oscillating and kind of touching each other, kind of ripe for transformation. And it kind of feels like it is a whole new world that Hilma's presenting to us that she's connected with in some way, because it's really quite baffling about where this came from, because it just feels like it must have flown out of her. And for her to execute all 10 of these works over 40 days, it must have really kind of flown out of her. But I did put in an image of one of the works that we didn't get to see there, which is Old Age. This is actually the final work of the 10 largest. But I think it's also just a really lovely example of just the, jumped away, sorry. You know, those works are really often talked about for the energy and their vibrancy, but this is kind of the work at the end of the series. It's meant to be speaking about what happens at the end of your life, what happens when you've lived your life, and perhaps energy's kind of flowed out of you a little bit, but it's got all these beautiful subtle elements, just kind of with the lighter creamy colors, the kind of way different elements feel like they're only just floating on the surface here. And also kind of, it becomes quite geometric away from that organic figures at the very beginning of the painting. And I love also the grid pattern here is quite lovely, because I was taking a group of, it's a really wonderful story I had from taking a group of children to look at these works, because we often looked at the 10 largest just because they were quite impressive. It was likely to grab attention for children. And we're talking about how we start at childhood and move through that old age. And this is, you know, work represents old age. And one of the kids said, well, of course this work must represent old age, because the grid pattern to him was a reference to the Rubik's Cube. And a Rubik's Cube is the type of logic puzzle that it takes your entire life to complete in some way. So that was how he was kind of connecting with the message inside these paintings and the process, that this is the symbol inside this work that to him represented that you've kind of reached your old age, you've reached a place of kind of knowledge, that you're kind of ready to kind of move on from life in many respects. So I always love this work now because I think that child stories really energized it for me in quite a different way. But moving on as we kind of progress, so that was the 10 largest. The next series, which kind of at this point, Hilma kind of stops making work for a couple of years. She kind of pauses. She's in the middle of executing the paintings for the temple. I think at this point, she's produced 111 paintings, which is something like a painting every 5 days for the past, I think, 4 years or so. So she takes a break, which we can talk about why she did that later. But when she returns to painting, the next series she executes is called the Swan Series. And this is a series that follows the transformation of 2 swans. You can kind of see in Swan 1, it's a series that's kind of really about balance and symmetry. These works are interesting because they get very geometric, but they do have these figures of the swan that appear in them. But it's all about these 2 swans meeting and kind of balance and holding each other in balance, and then entering conflict, which is what we see in Swan 2, and then kind of this transformation progress through coming back together, returning to wholeness, to oneness again. And at first glance, as a series, it can feel quite rigid in the abstract language it's using. As you can kind of see here, it's this real focus on geometry, on symmetry. Even with those figurative elements of the swans, the works feel like they're quite static. But it's a kind of a work like this, these works are kind of, when you spend time with them, you begin to notice that there's a lot more organic shapes hidden within them. And so this is, what's this one, Swan 8, which is, while it feels like it's a very geometric composition, it's quite static. It does feel one that's, once you spend time with it, you realize it feels like it's oscillating, there's energy, there's real tricks Hilma's using. She's using geometry as a way to really force your eye to move and slide around and control the way that you're viewing this work. And she's also using geometry in a way that kind of challenge us in the way we think about the world. I think she's arrived at abstraction and geometric abstraction as a really clever way to kind of show the way that we understand the world, because of course, by representing a 3D object in a 2-dimensional space, she's immediately telling us that there's different ways of understanding the world, different layers to the world than what we see, because while we perceive a 3-dimensional object, we know the truth of it is 2-dimensional. And if we take that basic truth and extend it more broadly, what else might be in the world that perhaps just because we can't see it doesn't mean it's kind of not the truth in some way. She gets quite deep into it. And Swan 17, which is kind of, sits in the middle of the series of 24 works, is one of the more kind of popular and famous works that's come out of Hilma's exhibition in recent years. And it's because this work is often pointed to by art historians as an example of the first abstract work in Western art. And so this is the kind of work that really throws up that conversation around like the history of art needs to be rewritten. The lessons that we've been teaching people, the way that we talk about art history isn't kind of truthful anymore because we now have Hilma. And it's because this work kind of does everything we expect from modern abstraction. It's all about plane, line, and color. So we have these huge planes of just flat color on the canvas. We use line to kind of dictate shape. And we use color to also break up sections of this work. And so when we look at kind of abstraction as it develops and becomes this kind of style that's championed by Western art and Western artists and critics, it's works like this that are kind of seen as kind of the best example of abstraction, or abstraction in its purest form. And so it's really interesting that it shows up in the middle of this series because it's amongst other works that perhaps aren't as strong in the abstract language. But also for Hilma, this wasn't just pure abstraction. For her, this was a symbolic form. Because as I was saying, it's all about that transformational moment of these swans. And I think this is also a really interesting lesson and what Hilma was trying to drive through around abstract language communicating these more complex ideas. Because it has all the kind of composite parts of these original swans that also feature the symbolic language he's working with. So we started off, let me just jump back to the original swans. So you see with these original 2 swans and Swan 1, it's black and white, it's upper and lower. The white swan has kind of the blue, the black swan has kind of these yellow features on its beak and feet. And so this is kind of a reference to kind of upper and lower spiritual material. The blue and yellow are referring to kind of the binary of gender, of blue for feminine, yellow for masculine. And the idea is, and it's these colors and these particular features that play out through the rest of the work. So as you kind of move through the series, you get the sense that it's something about transformation because the same elements are moving through the works, but they're just being reworked in some way. And it's in Swan 16 that they kind of show up in this really interesting, pure moment of kind of pause and contemplation in it. Because you have, why people look at it as this kind of abstract composition that they say is an example of Hilma being the first abstract artist. For Hilma, this work is kind of filled with symbolic power of transformation, because it's here in this moment that these swans are going through transformation and conflict, where they're trying to come back together and find harmony. And they've found harmony for a moment, but it's kind of not kind of true or genuine. And so you've got the black and the white of the original swans, you've got the blue and the yellow of the original swans as well, but they're in the sea of red, and red for Hilma was kind of a dangerous color. It could represent chaos, it could represent kind of dangerous love, is another way that she's discussed in her notebooks. But at the core of this kind of circle is this pink color, which in pink for Hilma represented ideal love, spiritual love, the highest form of love. And so the story or the symbolic power of this painting for Hilma, or that she's trying to communicate to us as a viewer, is that on this transformational journey of trying to come back to unity or completeness, these two swans have found a moment where they've pulled themselves into a circle, which is kind of universally acknowledged as this ideal form. And at the core of that is this ideal love. And that's what they're using as a core to pull themselves together to find this moment of peace and reprieve and kind of completeness amongst the chaos. And so for Hilma to be kind of called the first abstract artist, and the work being read in that really flat art historical way that's all about kind of a visual analysis, kind of devoids it of all of this symbolic power and meaning, which gives it this far richer texture. And so I think it's really interesting to look at it on both these sides, talk about it as an abstract work and talk about it as a symbolic work in the broader series of the Swan and the paintings for the temple, and see how you can hold both those things at the same time, because it does really demonstrate how Hilma developed and deployed this abstract language to really, reveal the power of it. And something else that some other art historians have talked about with this particular work is, while people do refer to this work as being quite geometric and non-organic, they say that you can still find organic forms into it. And so I've seen some art historians refer to this as the female breast, rather than a geometric form. So they're trying to kind of find all these different ways to talk about Hilma's work, because they see the layers within it. And some of the last series that we have in the paintings for the temple are two series, the Dove and the altarpieces. And the early works in the Dove series look quite similar to the Swan. They're kind of these canvases broken into quadrants with figuration and abstract forms still present. But as the series kind of gets near the end, it moves more into pure abstraction, with the figures kind of no longer present, and kind of pointing towards the final works in the painting temple cycle. These final works in the paintings for the temple have a really strong geometric abstract form, but also really kind of direct and obvious spiritual connections or connotations as well. And so these two works, I think, are some of the best examples of them. I think any of the three altarpieces are fantastic examples. But as you can see, kind of they're very geometric, they're broken down just to the basic shapes. But the geometric compositions refer to and are reminiscent of things like planets, the sun, pyramids, lotus, which are all recognizable shapes and objects that have kind of strong association, with different spiritualities. And so while this abstraction is probably, while this form of abstraction is probably Hilma at her most kind of refined and pure in the way she's using an abstract language, she's kind of spent a decade arriving at this particular form and language, and she's found a way to kind of still really clearly communicate and powerfully communicate the spiritual intent behind her works, but this very reduced visual language. And so that kind of wraps up the paintings for the temple. But there is kind of a later series, and this is a series called The Tree of Knowledge. And I'm always a little bit unsure whether or not the series sits inside the temple's paintings for the temple. I haven't been quite able to confirm that yet, but I do really love these works because I've kind of produced near the end of Hilma completing paintings for the temple. And I think they kind of pull together almost some of the best elements from all the work she's been doing for the past decade. I think it's because there's a real richness and texture to them all. And I think it's all these ideas we've encountered before. And so kind of with looking at these works again, it feels like Hilma's referencing organic forms. I mean, she's caught in the tree of knowledge, so you get a sense that they're probably, that she is referencing an organic form in the title, but they don't really look like trees. They look more like she could be referring to kind of, the shape of a brain or mushrooms or jellyfish. So these other really interesting organic forms we find in nature. They're quite curious because they feel very far from what it means to be human. But inside these works, she's again, Hilma's making very clear this idea of binaries, these things that sit against each other, because it does feel like these things really divided into two halves in these works. But I think similar as well to the 10 largest, they're works that feel really energized. It feels like there's a real sense of movement. To me, maybe less twirling, but more kind of things in motion, still things in motion, kind of a pulsating energy here that kind of feels like it's connecting or giving it almost a heartbeat. And so this is kind of where Hilma really, over the paintings of the temple, Hilma develops all these different abstract languages. She experiments and pushes herself. And after she completes the series, she really dedicates herself to kind of two projects that will both link back to this series of works. One is kind of actually getting the work exhibited, because in total, she ends up creating 193 works in the series, which is a huge body of work for anyone to exhibit, especially someone like Hilma, who doesn't really have much of a profile and work that looks so different to anything else being exhibited. So Hilma really spends a number of, almost a decade and a half trying to find a champion, trying to finding someone who'll show these works, because she does have that genuine belief that her work could change the world. But the other thing she does is, while Hilma's producing these works, she's just kind of painting under the guidance of the high master she's working with, who she's taken this commission from. So she doesn't totally understand the work she's created. So she also actually spends the rest of her life creating notebooks and studying the works and doing more learning and more seeking herself to look back at the work she's created to really kind of decode it and understand the messages that she's received from humanity. Because she sees herself as a person who receives the message, that doesn't necessarily mean she understands it. And so she does continue, after this, she continues to paint from time to time, and mainly she moves into watercolors. By the end of her life, we have 400 more watercolors. But there's a couple of interesting series I'll just point out. This one is a series of works she produced not long after the paintings of the temple called Parsifal. And if you're familiar with Arthurian legends, Parsifal is one of the Grail Knights, and he's known to be the knight who never gives up on seeking the Holy Grail. While the other knights might get distracted or kind of give up, he's one who never gives up. And it's a series of works that's quite dark that Hilma creates, or color-wise dark, but it's this constant return to spirals. So it's kind of, she really commits herself to this one formless work. But I think there's that real, the particular title she's chosen for this, I think, is really interesting. And the other type of work that we see come up kind of again and again, like I said, she moves into watercolors. And part of this is she reads Goethe's color theory, and that really influences her. She connects with Rudolf Steiner, who's a real champion of the wet on wet method. And of course, watercolor feels like a really powerful medium in a kind of art material way for someone working a spiritual way to create work, because it is this really insubstantial material. You can kind of get these beautiful layers where the colors kind of feel like they float on top of each other, kind of barely touch, but can really impact each other in some way. And this is a series of work she created in the 1920s called On the Viewing of Flowers and Trees, where Hilma was really trying to capture the spiritual life of plants, where she was trying to paint the auras and the souls of plants, because she was exploring this way of how does a human soul connect with a plant soul, and how does it connect into kind of a almost global soul that connects us all in many respects. I'll pause for questions here and jump back and answer them. Jump back and look at things. I can see there's some in the chats. Let me just give that a read.
Yeah. Okay, Caleb, great, fantastic. Okay, so from Arnie, thanks for the narrative coming from an art historian who were a bit hesitant to recognize the spiritual (theosophical) impact on art a few decades ago. So here's his question. Was Hilma executing these paintings during her seance sessions as she was an established medium?
The answer is sort of. It's a definite maybe. So part of it is the whole art historians or the establishment not wanting to recognize spiritual work is really interesting, because Hilma's family, when they opened up the works 20 years later, because they kind of knew what she was up to, but not really. And they're like, well, this is an incredible body of work that we've never seen before. And they tried to give the entire collection to the contemporary galleries, I think the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sweden, who basically took one look at the work and was like, well, we don't know who Hilma is. This work is totally unrecognizable for the period. We don't really want anything to do with it. Like, they basically rejected the gift of the entire collection. And now they've had to agree to become like part-time guardians and to help look after this collection, because they recognize it's kind of potentially a national treasure of Sweden. But in the 80s, they rejected looking after it all, where right now any gallery in the world would kind of sell a good chunk of their collection to get a part of Hilma. So it's left them a little embarrassed now that we're kind of in a more perhaps enlightened moment in art history. But Hilma, it's in her own writing, she talks about the different ways that she was creating these works. And it was, because she talks about it, she's it's not till very late in life that she really acknowledges that she's a mystic, and she kind of accepts that term, because she doesn't often talk about her. She talks about herself as kind of having many hats. She's a spiritualist, she's a medium, she's an artist, she's a writer, and they're kind of all interchangeable and fluid, but sometimes she doesn't kind of claim one identity over another. When she's talking about the painting to the temple, she discussed some different ways of kind of creating them, and we don't really know which set of works belong to which method. Sometimes she talks about kind of, she's the vessel and she gives that creative control, and she's just, this is kind of flowing through her, and that's kind of the work is then kind of complete. Other times she talks about kind of the work being laid out in front of her, and she's just kind of following the guidance of these high masters. Other times she kind of talks about, she's there painting, and it's like her friends around her kind of like encouraging her, saying like, you're doing a great job, you've understood the commission, we don't need to give you direction. And by the end of the painting to the temple, she feels really self-confident in her ability and her understanding of kind of the spiritual idea she's exploring. So she disconnects a little bit from the medium approach to painting, because she feels like she now doesn't need that assistant or need that guidance, that she can kind of do it for herself. But through the painting to the temple, she talks about having a lot of kind of basically being in conversation constantly with these spirit guides, who kind of to a lesser or greater degree are really directing the work. But she discusses like all these different ways without really committing to one or the other, or like particular what works there are in there. The works in front of us here that I've got up on the screen now, they are automatic drawings that she did before the paintings for the temple with the group DeFem, which I'll talk about in a moment. So she does also practice in that automatic drawing, automatic writing way of kind of creating work as well.
Okay, thanks. I got another question from the chat. Okay, from Esther. I often wonder if she read the stanzas as Kalama hunts of the swan. The black swan assuredly denotes the return to the absolute. Did she have contact with the society, the secret doctrine? The symbolism and imagery feel like she's really reaching into this, the black being the absolute and the light just being reflection and illusion. I can comment to that if you want to add something more, Caleb. So Esther, yes, so she, I've just got some notes here. She was part of the Swedish Federation of the society opened in Stockholm in 1889. Now, there is no record of her joining at that time. However, she was a member when the society became independent in Stockholm in 1904. So she did have access to the Theosophical teachings, and this obviously had an influence on her work in terms of the Secret Doctrine and the esoteric teachings. Anything else you want to add, Caleb? Or?
Yeah, all the records I have show the way we make up her timeline is we say she joined the Theosophical Society in 1904 when they formally established themselves in Stockholm. I found reference to her reading the Secret Doctrine. I don't know when she read it. I know she read it sometime between 1908 and 1912, which would be before she executed the Swan Series, which I think is why we think she read it then. She stops painting for about 4 years. Part of it feels like it's probably an encounter with Rudolf Steiner, who wasn't as encouraging as she wanted him to be. But part of it is her mother became quite unwell, so she became a primary caregiver for her. But there's this kind of 4-year period where she stops painting in the way that we know she was painting. And we know in that period, I've read essays from other people who've researched Hilma who say sometime in these 4 years she read the Secret Doctrine, because we know that over those 4 years while she wasn't painting, she was still reading really widely kind of philosophical texts, spiritualist texts, religious texts. And we think one of the ones she must have read over that period is the Secret Doctrine. It's perhaps she actually mentions it directly in her notebooks, like I said, but in Swedish and German, and I haven't seen them, but we do know she refers to things. She also has this terrible habit of just kind of mentioning something in passing, which you kind of have to interpret in her notebooks, because they were kind of, for her, I don't think she really thought anyone else would read them unless they knew her quite well. So I think you had to kind of know Hilma's life to decode notebooks. But she did read the Secret Doctrine at some point in the teens.
Okay, thanks, Chris. You've got a question, and hopefully your technology will work.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, very good.
That's good. Yes, I solved it. I do apologise for that, and thank you, Caleb. I'm just in touching. I won't worry about what I was going to say before, but just touching on what you have just been saying. Generally speaking, when someone identifies with spiritualist movements, we are talking about the groups that were known as the spiritualists, which is mediumship, psychic level, and so on. And clearly she investigated that, but she also apparently was exposed to theosophical thought in the Rosicrucians, which interest would be described as part of the spiritual journey. So when we say spiritualism or spiritualistic, it generally tends to attach itself to that more psychic mediumship level. And what you've shown us of her work, it seems to me that this guidance that she was referring to was coming from a much higher level than that of the psychic level, because when you look at her paintings, they're about the journey of the soul. They're about evolution. They're about the balance between the masculine and the feminine, because we do understand that at soul level we are both. And part of our journey in the physical plane is finding the balance, existing as men and women, or male and female. It's about finding the balance, because that's really what we are at soul level. So it just seems to me that when she spoke of a high master, yes, somebody was guiding her, but from a very high level. And looking at her work, I would hazard a guess that she started at that level of mediumship because she was obviously, must have been quite psychically aware herself. That gave her some very fundamental understanding of the existence of those other worlds. But when she did her work of her transformational paintings, she was operating, if you like, from a much higher part of herself, from her higher self. Yeah, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Back to you, Caleb.
Yeah, I think you've really touched on something that you do find when you're reading about Hilma, because she does, let me just see if I've got the slide here. Because she does start off quite early on participating in spiritist seances and joins the Literature Association. But she pretty quickly leaves her association with these groups, because I think these were groups that she was joined with other artists and kind of writers, kind of like literati of Stockholm. And she kind of joined them out of interest, but we know she talks about leaving them because she thinks that these people, she wants to go deeper and find a more genuine way of doing it, because she thinks these people are trying to find shortcuts to higher meanings that they're not ready for, and that you need to go through, do the work if you want to really connect with these kind of bigger messages and understand the world in a in a higher way, and that this kind of more kind of psychic spiritualist in a kind of popular sense approach to kind of reaching for that knowledge is really actually just kind of cheating and is only going to actually hurt you. And so she pretty quickly kind of joins it, has a bit of a time, has exposure, and goes, these people aren't for me, I want to do something that's a bit deeper. And that's where she starts to kind of join these other spiritualist circles and start to form her own groups that are about exploring with other people who I think taking it as seriously as her. Because you can see she joins the Edelweiss Society, and again, pretty quickly says, they're not for me, they're not helping me. So she starts a group called Defem the Five with four other women from the Edelweiss Society who kind of felt the same way. So she's kind of constantly trying to find a group of people who understand her, who are kind of searching the same way, but are kind of willing to put the work in. And she kind of moves quite quickly to find that group, and then she's trying to move in those circles with her life, where she's really quite discerning about who she's spending time with and who she's connecting with. But yeah, this is a brief timeline that I created with all the things I thought were probably interesting. I think I'm probably running out of time.
It's all right.
Which is
everyone's enthralled, no problems.
Yeah. But it was I think there's I mean, this is, I think, was just my way of showing that she was a person who was interested and engaged and trying to find different communities and groups to work with, to kind of push her, and that she could learn from, and was kind of, because she was constantly compelling herself and propelling herself through these different groups and organizations, just to try and find answers and try and find a different angle. Because there's an interesting thing I think I was reading recently about at the end of her life, she kind of still had questions. She was trying to answer questions, is what all her notes were about. And one of the questions she still had, oh, that's me at the end of the presentation, was about her, the high master she refers to. And this is actually a late notebook I think she created with Amanda Thomason Anderson, sorry, who was kind of the woman she collaborated with quite late in her life, had a relationship with as well. And it was because she talks about she and the five connected with these five spirits who they referred to as their high masters, who were kind of directing them, giving these messages. But one of the questions that she still hadn't answered at the end of her life, she's like, I don't know where these beings exist. I don't know where they come from. And that's something she was constantly striving for, which is why I think she was kind of circling and moving through different groups. If someone had an answer to that, and that's a question I think was always driving her, because quite early on she kind of was receiving messages. I love this particular notebook because it's her sketching these high masters, and she sketches them not in figures but in abstraction, because she's like, they exist in this higher plane, they don't have physical form the way we understand it. The closest thing I can get to understand their form is through abstraction, which I think is also part of that, what drove her to kind of an abstract language in her artwork, even if this is kind of a late notebook. Yeah, and I think the other element I was going to talk about was just about her association with other women, because I think like you maybe said, Simon, earlier, was when she kind of joined the Theosophical Society and found it, found a place in Stockholm. It was a place where, as a woman, she was, as important, if not more important, depending on some of the mediumistic circles she was moving in, than the men, which was really refreshing for her. And it was a place as an artist as well, that she could be as respected as an artist compared to other male artists. And I think that's where a lot of women who were artists and writers and scientists found a home in these different societies at that time, because it let them kind of be, you know, had the same footing as the men in the same field, where outside of these societies they were commonly seen as kind of less, or just kind of actually weren't given any time or respect. And so I think that's one of the reasons Hilma moved towards this, because she was a woman living independently. But you find that through her life, she really did move in these kind of, not just circles of different spiritual societies, but also circles of women. So from, I think, where have I put it now? 1896, she had founded the Defem group, which was together until about 1907, where there was some type of crisis in that group and they kind of fell apart. But quite soon after, she starts this new circle of women. That's 13 women that's part of it. I think it takes a couple of years to get up to 13. And that group of women work together and support each other in their art practice and their spiritual investigation, exploration for a number of years. And then it's the 1920s. I think that group kind of fizzles out, and she spends the rest of her life with Thomas and Anderson, who was her mother's nurse, actually. But they ended up kind of collaborating and working together for a number of years until Thomason's death. And like they took a number of trips to Dorna, where the Goetheanum is, where Steiner was based. I think they took about 8 trips between 1920 and 1930 to kind of explore the text there and research there. And so while she's always finding these circles, Hilma's always also finding these groups of women that she can support and they can support her. So I think Hilma and woman, I think, is also a really important element there, because I think she found, she really created her own little kind of society of women as this kind of group of spiritual explorers as well. That was, I think, everything I wanted to talk about, but now I'm happy to try and answer any questions.
Thanks, Caleb. Fantastic.
I have a question.
Sylvia, yes.
Yes, I